So following up on that conversation about the property valuation report and the common level of appraisal, we are going to spend our weekly time with Julia Richter with much gratitude for all the work she's doing on education finance this year. And essentially I asked her to take us through what impacts really look like, right? So we spend a lot of time, we all read the December 1st letter. We've all talked about sort of average tax rate. But as we're making decisions this year about the yield, I think it's helpful to sort of have the context of what does that actually mean for taxpayers, and to put some more numbers to those tax rates and those tax rate increases. And so she's going to take us through some scenarios. And then also want to remind folks that tomorrow we have our joint hearing at 1:15 with the Senate and the House Education Committee.
We'll be right here.
We will be here for that, yes. Julia, you want to join us?
Good morning. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Madam Chair, would you like me to just dive on into the slides? Okay, sure. And we cannonball. All right. Would you like me to share my screen?
I'd also like you to do that. Thank you.
Yes. So, as the chair mentioned, I've been asked to put together some examples of property tax rate calculations and also average bill changes just to help the committee get a sense of the basic math behind what we're talking about when we're looking at the Education Fund Outlook. So these slides are published on the committee page under my name. There's also the Education Fund Outlook that was presented to the Emergency Board, also published under my name. But we'll start out walking through the slides here. So two primary sections of the slides today. First, we're going to walk through an example of calculating and applying the 5% cap from Act 127 and seeing how the CLA fits into that calculation. And then we'll talk about some average bill change examples that correspond with the data presented on the Ed Fund Outlook from the Emergency Board. Before diving in, I have to, lead with the usual caveats. So here, all of the examples presented today, both the homestead, non-homestead, and districts are fictional, provided solely for illustrative purposes. So I tried to pick round numbers to help get a sense of scale, but they do not correspond with anything that's going to happen and do not correspond with specific districts. Also, this presentation is focused on non-homestead and homestead in the sense that specific examples for income sensitivity haven't been applied in the examples, and that's really to help keep things high level. When thinking about homestead, we'll recall that the intuition of income sensitized households and the way that rates are adjusted corresponds with the intuition of homestead. And we can talk about in more detail how things shake out, but that may need to be another set of slides and a deeper dive.
How are you using the word intuition?
In the sense that when we think about the calculation of a homestead property tax rate and how it's adjusted by district level spending, the same adjustment factor is applied for income.
Helps.
So first, we're going to start talking about calculating and applying the 5% cap. So we'll walk through the calculation of homestead property tax rates when including the transition provision, see how the CLA is applied. And yes, this is using fictional districts. So some of this may look familiar, talking about calculating a district's tax rate, homestead tax rate. We start with calculating the district's spending per pupil. So you'll recall that this is calculated by taking the district's education spending divided by its long-term weighted ADM. Ed spending, as you'll recall, is the school district's budget minus offsetting revenues like categorical aid.
Yeah. It's my understanding that that LTWADM has in general brought what has universally increased the number in the denominator.
Yes, that's correct. So while pre-Act 127, we did, the state did still use pupil weights in its funding formula, there was also a portion called the equalization ratio, which essentially added all of the weighted pupils and then applied this uniform ratio called the equalization ratio to bring them back down. Mathematically, it didn't make any difference. And so in Act 127, in the deliberations, the General Assembly decided to pull out the equalization ratio because it was just another step that wasn't adding anything to the calculation. So yeah, so now the denominator is much larger in this calculus, which is why we can't compare a district's spending per pupil as calculated this way to a district spending per pupil when calculated with equalized pupils.
So it made no mathematical difference within the year, but it's obviously made a mathematical difference now.
So when looking at the impact on a district, it doesn't make, the equalization ratio does not make any difference. The difference that's made is an apples to oranges comparison. So it makes a difference in the sense that we can't interpret a district's spending per pupil when there's two different ways that the denominator has been calculated. But uniformly across all districts, whether that ratio is or is not applied, doesn't matter. So yeah, so this is the spending per pupil. So we're talking about long-term weighted ADM. This is the Act 127 pupil weights. This is what we're going to be seeing moving forward, assuming no other legislative changes to the formula. So we've got three districts that we're going to just walk through. The whole presentation is going to have District A, B, and C. So what we're seeing here is District A. We can see that its education spending is about 15 million. Its long-term weighted ADM is 1150. And so when we divide ed spending by the long-term weighted ADM, we get the spending per pupil of 13,000. And we can see some differences here across districts. So see how while District B and C have the same education spending, because District C has more long-term weighted ADM than District B, correspondingly, they have a lower spending per pupil. We can also see that District A and B have the same number of long-term weighted ADM, but because District B has a higher education spending, they in turn have a higher spending per pupil. That's the first part of the calculation. Next, when calculating a district's equalized tax rates, we then divide the per pupil spending by the statewide property yield. So we know that this is set annually by the General Assembly. It's the same across the state. And I've included here the statewide property yields that was presented to the emergency board. So you can see here how
That's not the final yield, right?
it's not the final yield. If you look at the December 1 letter, I'm still working on the modeling for including the governor's recommended budget changes. So you'll see with every single policy change, every update in data, everything, the yield is going to go up or down to correspond with the many factors that are happening in the ed fund. So yeah, so this is solely an example. That's why we're assuming And this is already out of date because the governor recommended a budget yesterday that will then be deliberated by this body.
Is it fair to say, Julia, that those changes in the yield right now are volatile and because of the 5% cap?
Yes, I would say that the changes in the yield are the way that the yield has been interpreted in previous years, or the sense of, one penny on the tax rate corresponds with X number of dollars in the ed fund because of the 5% cap, and we don't know how a change up or down of the yield will impact a school district's rate, and if it will set them above the cap, and then we'll talk more about sort of the circularity of that. But yes, $1 more or less on the yield could correspond with different changes than we've seen in previous years.
Can you say something about the $1?
The $1, yes, here.
Yep.
Yeah, so the equalized homestead property tax rate and non-homestead property tax rate in statute is a minimum of $1. So when thinking about, I guess that would have been a helpful example to include, but if a district's spending per pupil is below the yield, so when looking at the equation, if this is less than that, then if there were not to be a minimum, then they would have a rate below $1. But what's written into statute is a district's homestead property tax rate cannot be lower than $1. So it's $1 or above $1 if that reflects their spending per pupil.
So, but changing that number would change everything.
Changing the minimum rate would change everything if there were districts that either were spending below the yield or would adjust their spending per pupil decisions to be lower if there were to be a lower minimum rate.
And there's is there a section on the report that we looked at last week about this?
Yes. So the Ed Finance report from 2023 that I walked through last week, there is a section of it regarding mechanics of setting the yields. And it talks about different iterations that the funding formula could be adjusted to have a fluctuating minimum rate. Okay. So now we've calculated the equalized homestead tax rate for these 3 example districts. We see districts A and C have the average homestead tax rate that was on the eBoard Outlook. And District B has a homestead tax rate above the average presented on the EF Outlook. So now that we've calculated those equalized rates, if there were no transition mechanism, we would move into applying the CLA. However, Act 127 has this 5% capping threshold. So this is where in the process the 5% cap sits into the formula. So we'll recall the transition mechanism caps districts' equalized homestead rate to a year-over-year increase of no more than 5% compared to the prior year. So we'll see now how that 5% may or may not be applied to these different districts. And you'll recall that all districts are eligible regardless of the impact of Act 127 on their weighted pupil count. So we start out and we say, okay, what were these districts' equalized homestead rates in FY24? So we just calculated their equalized FY25 rates, and now we're taking a look back and saying, what were they in the prior year? These are also made up from my head. And then we say, okay, what would be the FY24 equalized rate if it were to be increased by 5%? So this is, if they were to be increased by 5%, this is what the equalized rate would be in FY24. So we know this is the maximum, right, for these districts in terms of their equalized rate because it can't be increased by more than 5%. Then we calculate the growth of equalized rates from FY '24 to FY '25. So we say, okay, we know what the FY '24 equalized rate was. We know if there were no transition mechanism, what would the FY '25 rate would be, and then we calculate the growth. So we see that District A, if rates were not capped, their equalized rate would grow by 12.5%, District B, 6.5%, and District C, 3.9%. So then finally, we determine districts' equalized rates after considering the caps. So if districts' equalized homestead rates are increasing by more than 5% from FY '24 to FY '25, then they hit the cap and have an equalized homestead rate 5% higher. If districts' homestead rates are not increasing by more than 5%, then they will have the equalized rate that was calculated.
Representatives. And so since we're not setting a rate necessary to generate the amount of resources we need to cover that district spending, that shifts the costs to other districts that are not capped at 5% or non-homestead.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So we'll get into that if it's okay in 1 minute, once we just finish the math of the way that the rates are capped. And I just want to sort of put a cherry on the top of this calculation where we see that, okay, in districts A and B, because they would have increased by more than 5%, where we're taking the FY '24 rate, that 5% on top of the FY '24 rate, and District C, we see that they were not up to the 5%, so they get the FY '25 equalized rate. So yes, Representative Sims, as we can see in District A and B, their rate is not, the rate that they will be, the equalized rate will not be reflective of their spending per pupil decisions because it's capped, in which case there's that remainder that needs to be made up elsewhere. And I do think I have this on a bullet point. Oh, next is the CLA. I think I have it on a bullet point in a couple of slides, but essentially what that means is that additional revenue that needs to be raised elsewhere, right? Because the ed fund is self-balancing. How it's raised is a policy decision. If there's no other revenue streams into the ed fund, it means it will be raised either by homestead property taxpayers in districts that are not capped at 5% and or non-homestead property taxpayers.
And maybe this is the circular loop that you're gonna get into later, that cap for some districts that shifts. Then need to raise revenue, but does that actually maybe force some other schools up above that 5%, and then it's more get capped at 5%, this sort of maxes out at some point? Because everyone's been driven up above 5%.
Exactly. So if all districts are capped, that will depend on all of the other ins and outs of the education fund. But what you're speaking about with respect to the circular nature of capping of the capped rates is certainly true. And that's why the intuition that we've used in previous years of, a penny on the tax rate corresponds with X number of dollars of revenue does not hold true this year, because we don't know with every little change how that circular nature will play through in all of the capping and then the additional revenue that needs to be raised by others.
And so maybe more than in previous, is it fair to say that more than in previous years, tax rates are reflective of not only your towns, your school districts, local spending decisions, but also other districts' spending decisions?
I would hesitate to say it from, I personally would hesitate to say it in such a binary way because the yield always picks up all spending decisions of districts. So it's more of a question of the direct relationship to a district's spending per pupil, I'd say, rather than the other districts' spending decisions.
That circle of the increased dollar yield and the pumping more over the cap and increases, that circle gonna stop at some point while you're running through your simulations, right?
Yes, so at some point, the yield will be low enough or would be low enough, in which case all districts would be capped at 5%.
Is that the only way it would stop?
Yeah, so that's the only, because so if we think about the way that a district's rate is calculated, right? We've got the district's per pupil spending divided by the yield. And so the yield, these are the factors that are going into a district's rate. So the per pupil spending varies by district. The yield is true across the state. So the lower the yield goes, the higher the homestead property tax rates will be in districts, all else equal.
Yep.
So essentially, as we need to raise more money and to increase, or if we need to increase rates, then the statewide lever is to lower the yield if you want to increase the revenue with homestead property taxes. And so by decreasing the yield, then that will increase districts' homestead rates.
Which will bump it over to 5.
Exactly.
So yeah, what you're saying is inevitably that would happen. Every district will be capped.
It would depend on all of the other forces in the education fund, or all of the other factors in the ed
I
fund.
guess I would offer, when we first did the work, and many of the people in this room did the work to pass 127, we were modeling the 5% threshold with a much smaller number of districts being able to use it, because we were not taking into account all of the other inflationary pressures on education spending this year that happened to be happening this year. So we were not taking into account that sort of tax rate trough that Jake Feldman described, 20 minutes ago, or the increase in health insurance costs sort of across the state, regardless of what sector you're in, or the increase in fuel costs, or, the new teacher contracts, or the pandemic impact on the need for mental health services in the school, right? So we weren't taking into account all those other inflationary pressures that in this environment, with all those inflationary pressures, are leading so many districts to be spending much more than they would have. And, and then that trough, the change from the trough, coming out of that trough, is also sort of leading people closer to that 5%. So I don't want to call it inevitable, because I think there's a very reasonable other world scenario that we're not living in, where it's just 6 districts using that 5%.
But with all things as they are now, with the projections as they are now, that would be the inevitable result. Unless we change things.
No, not necessarily.
So I think that the helpful framing for the conversation is, in theory, we could get to a place in the education fund where all districts' rates are capped at 5%. And that would depend on the factors in the education fund. So currently, the modeling that was presented to the e-board does not have all districts capped, because the yield is not low enough to cap all districts. So it's a function. How many districts are capped is a function of
We have to see how the spending. how
We
the
have to see
budget's
how the
passed.
spending, exactly.
Yeah, that's the big, yeah, we have to see how,
And districts are still making decisions about that even now.
okay, yeah, that sounds, yeah, thank you.
Back to you, Julia.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that that's everything I had prepared to say with respect to how the 5% cap fits into the calculus here. So now moving on to the application of the CLA. This likely looks familiar to what you just looked at with Jake. But just to remind you all, that the CLA adjusts homestead and non-homestead education tax rates to ensure that each town is treated equally and uniformly, regardless of when they were last appraised and the growth of their grand list. Because we have a statewide education fund, we need to make sure that everyone is adjusted accordingly. So the CLA is applied to the tax rate, as Jake spoke about. So we take that equalized tax rate that we just calculated for these 3 districts and divide by the CLA. And this is true regardless of the 5% Act 127 cap. This is how it's done. This is how it was done pre Act 127. So the equalized tax rate divided by the CLA. So thinking about that, you can think about if the CLA is below 100%, that will in turn increase the equalized tax rate up to account for it, with the CLA being below 100%. And if the CLA is above 100%, it will adjust the equalized tax rate down to also adjust for the fact that the CLA is over 100%. So here we have the same 3 districts where we just calculated their equalized homestead tax rate. We can see that District C has the average CLA in 2023 of 0.78. That District B is 100%. So they do not need the CLA because they are right on the nose. And District A is lower at 0.6. So we can see that when applying the CLA to the equalized rate, District B does not need its rate to change because they're 100% at fair market value. And then we can see District C and District A have their rates, their equalized rates increased to ensure that those districts are paying their fair share to the education fund.
That's the same question of you that I asked Jake. If we just got rid of the CLA, would schools be left with their equalized homestead tax rate as it is in this scenario? Or if we got rid of the CLA, would that adjust the yield calculation because you're factoring in the equalized grand list? Like if we lived in an environment where we didn't use the CLA, would it adjust equalized homestead tax rates?
Yeah, so if there were no CLA, then districts would not be paying the amount into the education fund that they were responsible of paying into the education fund because their property values were not reflecting their fair market value. So the CLA is really needed to ensure that we're adjusting districts accordingly. Mathematically, if you were to just wipe out the CLA, yes, the yield would. So if you were to just get rid of the CLA and not change anything, then the education fund would be short because the average CLA is below 100%. And so in all of the modeling that we're doing, we're always including the CLA in the modeling to ensure that the right amount of funds are being raised. Getting rid of the CLA yeah, if you were to get rid of it, then the ed fund would be short. I'm not sure how much. Jake probably knows that number off the top of his head. And then if you were to adjust the yield would need to change to account for fewer dollars coming into the education fund. You just watched my mind work through that.
Do you have another?
Well, and so like, just to try to be as explicit as possible, like, you know, again, I'm hearing from folks are like, well, look how great our equalized homestead tax rate was, and now, boy, like, this actual homestead tax rate is like so much different if we, you know, and I think there's embedded in that an assumption that like, we just didn't have that pesky CLA, people could have that much lower equalized homestead tax rate, but I think what you're saying is likely there would be changes to the yield that that mean you wouldn't just get that lower equalized, that the whole formula would have to adjust. And
Right.
likely districts would be back with a very similar rate that their actual homestead, that because it's all
There wouldn't be enough, if everyone were to just have their equalized rate and there was no CLA, there just wouldn't be enough money for the ed fund. So we would be running a huge deficit. And so,
and because it's self-balancing, we'd have to adjust to ensure that we have not have a big goal.
exactly. And I do think I think the committee is aware, and I also think it's important just to keep reminding folks that the CLA is not contributing to any change in tax bills. If spending were to be the same and property values were to increase, then we would see the tax rates decreasing to account for the increase in property values, and it would be the same bill, right? We've been seeing CLAs decreasing over the past couple years, and we haven't been seeing the estimated average bill changes that we're seeing this year. And that's because we haven't seen the same pressure on the education fund that we're seeing this year. So the CLA are not the reason that tax bills are estimated to increase.
Representative Demer, I just wanted to give that like all of
Yeah.
the surrounding moment needed. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I get the reason for the CLA. I completely understand that. I think one of the things in conversation, this is just a comment, not really a question, but in conversations I have with folks who live in the district that I represent, I think that they oftentimes, it's the way that we apply it to the tax rate rather than a value of their homestead value, ends up abstracting it in a way that they're not able to really, it becomes easy to make it a boogeyman. And I don't know if there's a way around that or if there's some other way to do it, but it just seems to me that that application to the homestead tax rate kind of abstracts it a bit, and they don't necessarily make that correlation between the value of their home and their tax rate. And I think the other piece of it too is that so many people don't understand that they pay based on income. Just one up further.
And just to respond to that comment, I will add that if the CLA were to be applied, mathematically, applying the CLA to the tax rate or applying the CLA to the property value mathematically is the same.
Back to you.
Okay. So that's how the actual homestead tax rate that's showing up on people's property tax bills would be calculated for these three fictional districts. So wrapping up, I think that we've really spoken about everything here. But getting back to some of the questions earlier, districts that receive the 5% rate cap will not see the full increase in their homestead property tax rate that corresponds with their per pupil spending. And so unless other revenue sources are added to the ed fund and or costs decrease, then this cost will need to be made up by homestead property taxpayers in districts without a capped rate, which may lead to the circular nature we spoke about, and or non-homestead property taxpayers. We saw the transition provision caps the average homestead rate increase, not the average bill increase. And just keeping in mind that the property tax bills are comprised of two factors, the tax rates and the property values. So while the rates are capped, equalized rates are capped, the values are not. And so this corresponds with the estimated grand list in the education growth. Or the estimated growth in the education grand list. So that wraps up what I prepared to speak about with respect to examples for average tax rate calculations. Would you like me to move into average bill change examples?
I feel excited about that. Everyone ready? I'm serious. I was anxious about it. Okay. Great.
Okay, sure. Again, caveats. We're talking about examples. And since, as the committee is well aware, overall property tax bills vary depending on multiple factors. The analysis of average changes really needs to be interpreted with caution, because we're talking averages and not talking about specific instances. The following examples consider homestead and non-homestead property in the districts that we just calculated the rates for, A, B, and C. As I mentioned up front, the following examples do not include income sensitivity because I didn't think that there would be enough time in today's presentation to dive deeper into that. But we can talk about it if there's questions, of course. 2/3 of homesteads receive some form of income sensitivity, but of course, the amount that they receive is dependent on where they live, their homestead value, and their household income. So getting back to the idea of the intuition applies in the sense that the district's spending decisions impact income sensitized folks in the same way that they impact non-income sensitized folks. So starting out with District C, which I've kind of thought of as the average district, using air quotes for average district because we live in a diverse state with a lot of different factors going on. So the parameters of District C, we had an equalized rate of 1.350, which was the equalized average homestead rate presented to the E-Board. District C has the average CLA in 2023, which has the actual homestead rate for District C at 1.731. So all of the examples here are a 17.3% average bill increase because that was what was in the E-Board. Preliminary modeling with respect to the governor's recommended budget likely will once again go up from the 17.3, probably closer to the December 1 projections, but I haven't finished that modeling yet. So what we're seeing here is an average bill change for homestead property taxpayers who are not income sensitized by homestead value. So we can see that a homestead value of 200,000 would see an average bill increase of $540, where a homestead value of 800,000 would see an average bill increase of 2,160.
I just want to make sure that this is still in the world where there is a 5% cap.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
This is in the world that we just painted, where we're relying on all of these December 1 assumptions and then some updates for the E-Board and all of the swirl that is and will change between now and May as better data comes in.
And the idea here is that, you know, The December 1st letter talks about average changes and to just get our heads around what it actually means in terms of dollars in someone's household. Thanks.
So this is average bill increase for homestead in this average district, and then non-homestead in the same district. So we'll recall that the equalized non-homestead rate is uniform across Vermont. So also in the e-board modeling, we had an equalized non-homestead rate of 1.432. So with that average CLA applied as well, we get to the actual non-homestead rate of 1.836. And so this is what an average bill change would look like for the non-homestead property taxpayers in this district. Shall I continue?
Go back one.
Yeah.
And then again. Thanks. Yes, please.
Would it be, do you want me to read through the, okay. We'll go through the other two districts and I'll just remind the committee the way that, this is really done is we take the value of the property, we divide by 100 and we multiply by the actual rate. So that's how we're coming up with the tax bill. I backed into the FY24 tax bill by just seeing, what a 17.3% growth would look like. Next, going to District A, which I labeled the above average district. Maybe there was a better way to label it, but essentially this is a district that would be seeing, it's got a actual homestead rate that's greater than the district we just looked at. So in this example, we can see that while these property tax payers would also be seeing a 17.3% average bill change, the absolute value of what that average bill change is differs from the prior district. It's higher because they have a higher rate than than District C. So that's what we're looking at here, the non-income sensitized homestead property taxpayers and corresponding bill change. If it were to be 17.3%.
Representative Bradley?
Julia, I know like 40% of the people in Vermont get the income sensitivity on their tax bill. That means their taxes are reduced.
Wait, can you, I'm sorry, is it 40%? I just want to make sure you're asking.
It's approximately 2/3.
That makes it worse.
Okay, so now ask your question.
Okay, so my question, now I'm good.
Okay.
So somebody's picking up that tab, but the 60% aren't paying because the school costs don't change.
Right.
So does that makes it worse on the 40%, right? Or on the 34% that are left, if it's 66 or what do you say, 60%, whatever it is, the remainder, somebody has to pick up that tab. So looking at the impact on these high level earners and people who live in expensive properties and who don't qualify for income sensitivity, someone's gonna have to pick up that tab. And you see where I'm going?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a tax credit. So certainly, tax credits cost money, because it's revenue that is not being collected from certain taxpayers or being refunded to them. And that's included in the education fund outlook. So in FY25, the property tax credit, so that income sensitivity portion, is 158, estimated to be 158.3 million. So that's what we're seeing here in lot.
No, yeah, yeah.
1B.
But I mean, I think every other property owner in the state picks up that tab, whether they're income sensitized or homestead or not homestead.
How do the ones pick it up who are getting?
'Cause it drives their yield down, which drives their income rate up. I mean, everybody pays that. It's not just the people that aren't income sensitized.
I don't see how everybody pays. I thought it was only that 40%. Tell me again.
They get the
Let's have
benefit.
Julia explain.
Sure, so the way that income sensitivity works is the size of the property, for those who qualify, the size of the property tax credit is dependent on both their household income and their household, their homestead house site value. So what that means is different homestead property taxpayers will be receiving a property tax credit of different sizes. So while 66% of folks receive some property tax credit, the size of the property tax credit differs. So getting back to the question of everybody picks up that cost, it is true that all three classes, the homestead, non-homestead, and income sensitized homestead, are all needing to raise sufficient revenue to make sure that the property tax credit is flowing out fully and fully funded. So that means that there are folks who receive a property tax credit who in turn have a little bit of a higher liability or a much higher liability to ensure that the property tax credit is fully funded.
We're really hitting those people hard. Because then if we institute this wealth tax, the surcharge. That's really significant.
Personally, I'm feeling like the education fund is enough of an incredibly complex situation right now that I am trying to look at it in as much isolation as I possibly can, considering that every single factor in our entire economy also feeds into it. But I hear what you're saying. Representative Taylor, did you?
Yeah, quick question. The 200, 400, 600, 800 values, if somebody's looking at that table and thinking of their home, that's the value that's on their tax bill. That's primarily the grand list value, they're not thinking, values have gone up, so I must be paying more prices. You see what I mean?
Yes, so these examples have the actual homestead rate applied. However, it really depends on what community that property taxpayer lives in, with respect to what is the CLA and what is the equalized homestead rate.
Oh, someone's looking at this and saying, what's my house is worth, well, geez, it used to be worth 400,000, but with the real estate market now, it's probably worth 600. That's not the way they should be thinking.
Correct.
They should be thinking the value as set on my last tax bill.
Yes,
Is the line. Okay.
exactly. Okay, so we're looking at District A, which is that above average district with an actual homestead rate of 2.1 and a CLA of 0.6. So moving on to what non-homestead would look like in this district. So still, the equalized non-homestead rate is the same because it's uniform across the state, but now we're seeing a different actual non-homestead rate because the CLA is lower in District A than it was in District C. So this is where we're seeing the corresponding average bill changes for those non-homestead property taxpayers in District A. In this totally made up world that we're talking about today. Okay, and finally, we'll move into the last district we calculated, which is District B, the below average. So this is where the CLA is 1, and the equalized rate was 1.523. And we can see again the corresponding bill changes for these example homesteads that are not income sensitized. And finally, the non-homestead in District B. Again, we've got a CLA of 1 and the uniform non-homestead rate. So the corresponding bill changes in this district.
Felt that sigh.
It's a bad habit that I have. So it's just when I'm thinking,
You need extra air when you're thinking.
I do need extra air. Used to get me in trouble in school.
Needing air.
Just needing to sigh, yeah. So that's what we're seeing for non-homestead, in this below average district.
And not that the children there are below average. It's not like a Harrison Keeler kind of thing. It's just
Yes,
below, like the rate is below what we imagine the state average would be.
exactly. Thank you.
Yes.
Since you clarified the characterization below average, I have to take my own deep breath. My community was part of a forced merger with a community which was very different. And the policy choice was made to apply the old and now the new pupil weights to the district, not to the schools. And I think that what has happened is because the rate that's calculated is for the whole district, the individual communities lost or gained advantage or disadvantage in the switch in the weights. And I have to sit down and do the math separately. But I think what's happened is that the weighting would have advantaged city, my community, but won't to the extent to which it could have if the calculation were kept for the school or the town, not the district, because of the averaging that has gone on across the two very different communities. And I'm not sure I can do the math to do it separately, but that intuitively, I think that's what's happening. And I don't think there's a remedy for my community.
Well, I guess I would offer a reflection from the debate about Act 127 when we were working on it, which is that the purpose of a district is that the district is designed to allocate resources equitably within the district. And so it's not about sort of a community being advantaged or disadvantaged or gaining or losing tax capacity in the context of others. It's that we're right-sizing the tax capacity to match the needs of that district. If you have students in your district with less high needs, those students would need less resources. And your district should be allocating resources to, say, the school or the students that you are describing that have those needs.
Yeah.
And so whatever size the district is, you know, a much larger district with multiple schools in it that might have lots of socioeconomic or other kinds of diversity in it, right, is allocating based on that diversity across schools, which is like, that's what districts should be doing. If we start dividing it up and talking about like on a town by town basis or school by school basis, we lose track of all of the really important work that happens district wide that requires resources and contributes equity, like special education, for instance, which is a big part of the equity puzzle in a school. So I think when we start thinking on a town by town level, we lose track of both like the promise of the education fund as a shared resource, but also the purpose of school districts as an opportunity to allocate resources amongst the incredible socioeconomic diversity that we do have in Vermont. But I also know that there were a lot of towns and districts that thought that they were going to sort of wash out one way in the people waiting bill and didn't. And certainly, like, as we watch the modeling, the degree to which the modeling is not intuitive is really very hard to grapple with.
And I would add from my perspective, that while some towns and districts line up perfectly, right, there are also some towns that are part of 3 districts or 2 districts. So they're overlaid on top of one another. And while sometimes that lines up perfectly, other times it doesn't. And so it's really difficult. For me, I can't go from a town rate to a district rate, but I can go from a district rate to a town rate. Okay, I think that this is actually the final slide that I put together for today. Just some high-level considerations, what we've spoken about. Bill changes vary by district and by taxpayer. So all of the examples that we've looked at show an average bill change of 17.3, but in reality, it will vary widely across the state, even if what was presented to the e-board is what comes to pass, which we know is unlikely because of all of the outstanding information. CLAs are not the reason that taxes are forecasted to increase in FY25, really just an adjustment factor. And lastly, capping districts' equalized tax rates means that the revenues not raised by those districts need to be raised elsewhere.
Outstanding questions for folks, either for Julia or for future testimony? Let's start with Julia.
Lots of questions about the
Okay, thank you.
current year, but
Oh, sorry, no, Chris.
No, totally fine, totally fine. I was just gonna ask, do we know the number of districts sitting together?
I don't know at this point, because we don't have any budget data.
Yep.
Yeah, so once we get budget data from AOE and we start plugging in actual warned budgets, then we will have a much better sense. Yeah.
Cool.
and the timeline on that?
So we are hoping to the Agency of Education is working on getting both more information on warned budgets. I don't know if folks remember like all the other years that we've done this, but we start having weekly or every other week check-ins as more warned budget information comes in. We will start doing that next week and are hopeful that we'll have some data. Then districts know what a very complex year this is for us to be setting the yield and are responsive with data. Also, they're going to ask for some additional information for us so we can get a little more discernment on what the inflationary pressures are on education spending this year. I think we all sort of have ideas. They range from like rumor to speculation to case study. But we don't have the ability right now to do analysis sort of across districts. And so we're hoping for some more data on details around like the various ways money can be spent on special education, mental health costs, infrastructure costs, those kinds of things, capital costs. We have not spent much time talking about the income yield. Is that something that folks want to dive into soon? Okay, we've certainly talked around it a great deal. Okay. Thank you, Julia. What are other next steps? So tomorrow we'll be hearing from districts about what this looks like, feels like, and what they think about all this. Again, those are we've worked with the School Boards Association and the NEA and Superintendent's Association and the Business Managers Association to try to get a diverse range of schools in terms of both sort of geography, spending patterns, voting patterns, experience of the 5%, all of those things. And so certainly we're not going to hear from everyone that has something to say tomorrow, but I'm hopeful that it is a wide range of perspectives that we're hearing from tomorrow. I don't have hope that there's going to be a clear consensus coming out of tomorrow's hearing, and so I encourage you not to have that hope as well. Other things that like very soon future testimony would be helpful on. Yeah.
I'm wondering that with that, the 18 or 17%, what the standard deviation, how much is that? How broad that is, I'm wondering.
Oh, that's a great question. I guess I would offer that as soon as we get more up-to-date budget information, which should be any day, the 17 to 18% gets tossed into the dust pile of history and we have a new percentage. But knowing what the range of that is really helpful.
That's the standard
Yep.
deviation for it.
Anyone else? Humans, you want to hear testimony from that we might not? Here.
Is there a list of who's coming on Thursday?
Who's coming?
Sorsha, it's in process.
Lots of figures.
It's so hard to identify who's missing. So
Yes, I'm saying as sort of outside of the hearing context tomorrow, are there other, yes, are there other folks you would want to hear from just sort of in the course of our regular committee time?
Jeff Francis again.
Okay.
You know, if all these superintendents are gonna tell us the same thing.
They're not. I wish they would. It would make things clearer, but they're not. Yes.
That's why I think that there's.
And I will say it's also, it's a good mix of some districts we're hearing from a business manager, some districts we're hearing from a school board chair, and some districts we're hearing from a superintendent. And so we also have that mix, which is some different perspectives. I know in some districts, superintendents and school boards might have some sort of space on their perspective on how budgeting is working or should work. Okay, be in touch with thoughts, brainstorms, Post-it notes, any and all ways of thinking about this. Soon we're gonna have to narrow our field towards decisions. Oh, and we'll be back here at 1:15. And we're gonna be picking up at 1:15, we're gonna be picking up S-160, which is the flood abatement bill that just came over from the Senate. We've already looked at an identical version of the bill in the form of H something. And towns are really, really looking to us to be moving this bill as fast as possible. It was not put in budget adjustment because we wanted to move faster than budget adjustment does. So spend some time before we sit down again, getting your head around things, please.
H160.
S-160, and it's posted for this afternoon. And I'll see you back here at 1:15.